Welcome to this Wix Blocks tutorial. Hi, my name is Ben Ari, and I'm a tech lead in the Wix Blocks group. Before we start, let's briefly go over what we have for you today. So I'll start with a brief introduction into Wix Blocks. Then we'll see a quick demo of the application that we will be building together, a countdown application. And then for the majority of this session, we'll do a live coding tutorial where we will be building this application together using Wix Blocks. But first, why Wix Blocks? What problems are we trying to solve using this product? So developing a custom solution using the editors and Velo code is great. But once we develop such a solution on one site, we cannot easily reuse it across all of our sites. Secondly, such a solution, for example, a countdown application, probably will have some configuration, let's say the end date to count down to. We cannot easily configure this end date. So let's say we want to hand over this site to a client and they will need to change the end date. They will probably need to touch our Velo code. That's not optimal. Next, some of the times our UI can get a bit complex. And using Velo today, we have to develop our entire UI as a single monolith inside of our page. That's not how modern UI frameworks work, where we can compose our UI out of separate components and build them all together, which is a lot easier in terms of development experience. And one big last thing is fluidity on the Wix editor. We all know Editor X allows us to create a fluid and responsive layouts. So let's say we developed our countdown on Editor X, it will be responsive and great, but we cannot use it in the Wix editor. So that brings us into Wix Blocks. It's a visual workspace for building responsive Wix applications. These widgets, these applications can be composed of widgets, settings panels for those widgets, backend logic, data collections, and much more. These widgets are composed out of native editor elements, and their logic is implemented using Velo code. Next, these applications can be installed on all editors, on Editor X and the Wix editor. And the fluidity is maintained across both of the editors. And lastly, some of you may be already familiar with Wix Blocks as a tool for creating reusable code packages. Today, we introduce all of these changes for building entire applications. So let's start with our demo. I have here a clone of the Wix DevCon site. And in here, I have installed my countdown application. As you can see, indeed, it counts down to some date that I have pre-configured. And as we said, it has a fluid layout based on grid definitions. Let's go back to the editor and play with it a little bit. Let's say I want to change the end date. So I simply select my countdown widget, click settings. This opens a custom settings panel that I've created inside Wix Blocks. And here I can set a different date, let's say the 20th. Great, it's updated. An additional logic that we would like to have is for user to be able to register for notifications by email before the event arrives. So a site visitor can click here, notify me, insert an email, And one day before the event arrives, they will receive this triggered email that I have configured on my site. So I have the email that I have created here. All I need to do is copy its ID and apply it to the widget settings. By the end of our tutorial, we will see it all working together. So before we start building our application, let's describe its architecture. We need to have one main widget, our countdown widget, and it has one inner widget to implement the email registration. Then we will need settings for our widget to have it configurable. We need the end date property and the ID of the triggered email. Then we'll need to create a custom settings panel to edit those settings on the editor. Because we want visitors to be able to register, we need to store data. We'll store it in a data collection, the subscriptions collection. And of course, we will be using Wix CRM APIs to create contacts and to email them. And lastly, we will need backend functionality that will actually send the triggered emails, and it will be invoked by a scheduled task that will run once every hour. So let's get into building. I'll launch my Blocks workspace. And I have already implemented the template to start from. This is the Wix Blocks workspace. Here on the left, we have our widgets view that displays all of our widgets. We can navigate between them, and of course, create new ones. On the bottom, each widget has its design presets. We will see how they function in a few more minutes. Here in the center, we can see our main design canvas for designing our widget. We can see this widget already has a grid layout, and we will be using it. On the bottom, we have the Velo code editor. And on the left, the entire Velo IDE. Let's implement our main widget. We will finish its design, set its API, develop its logic, and then preview it. As we can see, our widget is already pre-designed, but it's missing the second text. Let's add it. I'll just duplicate this element and set its correct layout. It needs to be positioned in this grid cell, have these margins, and of course, we need to set its placeholder text to seconds. I think it looks good. Because we want to have Velo logic for this element, let's give it a meaningful ID. Let's call it seconds.txt. Now we said we want this widget to be configurable. For that, we need to define widget properties. To do that, we have the public API panel. Let's create two new properties. The first one is the end date. It's of type date and time. Let's give it a default value for tomorrow. We'll create a second property for the triggered email ID. Now we can start writing code. So let's create a function that will update the remaining time. I'll call it update time. And what it needs to do is to calculate the remaining time between now and the configured end date. So I have created a utility function called getRemainingTime. You pass it the end date, and it returns the remaining time, broken down into days, hours, minutes, and seconds. Very handy. So let's use it. Now we need to pass the end time that was configured for this widget. So to do that, we have the new API, $widget.props. It holds all of our widget's properties. So we will pass the end date. Just need to cast it into a date. We will grab the values, days, hours, minutes, and seconds, and set those values to the text elements. So the days part is ready. Let's copy and paste. Hours, minutes, and seconds. And again, hours, minutes, and seconds. That's it. We're ready to use our function. Let's invoke it once in the widget's onReady function. Now let's preview. We can see the initial remaining time. Great. Now let's make it tick. So we will set an interval that will invoke update time once every second. Now, before we are done, we need to take care of one last thing. And that is because of a change between our widgets onReady function and the regular site page onReady function. Unlike the regular page onReady function that is executed when you go to preview or when viewing the live site, the widgets onReady function is executed during editing time, when we load the editor and when we change the properties of the widget. Now, since we don't want the widget to start ticking down when the editor loads, we just need to add one condition, and that is that the view mode doesn't equal editor. And that's it. Let's preview. And as we can see, it's working. It is ticking down. Now, let's say I want to test how this widget behaves when I change the end date. I just use test API properties and set another end date. Let's say 22. Great, it all works. Now I want to create a custom panel for my widget. To do that, we have the panels tab. Now I have already implemented this settings panel. So let's watch a short clip of how I did it. So I create a new panel and give it a name. And I just add my inputs, 2 text inputs for the end date and for the triggered email ID. I just set some settings like the titles and the placeholder texts. We set the title of our section divider for the triggered email. And now it's time to implement our panel's logic. So this panel needs to do 2 things. When it loads, it needs to read the current properties of the widget and set their values to the inputs. And when the inputs change, it needs to set the new properties values. So in order to do that, we have a new API in the panel builder called Wix widget, and we will use it. So when the panel loads, we call Wix widget.getProps. It provides the current property values of the widget. We take the end date and the email ID and assign those to the inputs. We assign the end date value and the email ID value. Then we need to listen to the onChange event of the inputs. So we do just that, onChange, and then we use wixwidget.setProps to set the new settings, the new properties of the widget. And that's it. Our panel is done. Now, all that's left to do is to configure a button in the widget's action bar to actually open this panel. So in order to do that, we have the widget's configuration tab. This is where we can configure all of the edit time behavior of our widget. So for example, I can change its component name on the editor. Let's call it my countdown. And here I can edit its action bar. So I have here this settings button. I could change it to settings 1, 2, 3, but let's keep it settings. And I just need to select the panel, my settings that I just created. Great. So we have our main logic and a custom settings panel. It's time to test our widget on an editor. So let's build our application for the first time. Here we can click build. The first time we build it, we will need to provide an app namespace. The app namespace has two purposes. The first one, it will enable the editor's Velo code to import functions from this application using the namespace. And secondly, once we have data collections in our application, these collections will be nested under this namespace. So my new application 9 is a good enough namespace for me. Let me just copy it, click next, and we will release a major version of application. Let's click build. This will build our application and make it available for me across all of my sites. We can see here it is still working and building version 1.0, and it will be done in a few seconds. Great, we have it. So let's go to a blank editor that I have here. And now you can see here in the Add Apps panel, where we used to have the app market, we have an additional tab called Private Apps, where I have all of my private applications. Let's search for my new application 9. When I click it, I see a bunch of details about it. Let's click Install App. So now my application is being installed, and once it's finished, it will automatically open the Add panel on a new category called My Widgets. And here I have all of my application's widgets, and I can simply drag and drop it here to stage. As we can see, live preview is working. It displays the initial remaining time. Let's check our settings panel. We'll open it and change this to another end date. Let's say, great, it works. So let's move this to tomorrow. We can stretch it. Nice. we can see all of the individual elements that that this widget is composed of are selectable, and I can simply edit them. Let's see, the preview is working. Very nice. So let's get back into building. And we will implement the registration part. So this is our registration widget. It's already implemented. So let's see how. Let's use the layers panel to see it. So it's made of a multi-state box with 3 states. The initial one is a call to action where the visitor can click notify me. And then we switch state to the register state where the visitor can enter their email and click submit. And once they click submit, this widget will invoke an event, the onSubmit event, that the countdown widget can listen to and then perform the actual registration. And this widget will switch state to the thank you state. Now, another thing I want to show regarding this widget is that the design presets that we mentioned. As you can see, this layout works great for desktop, but it's not that great for mobile. These elements overlap. So we can create another design preset for this widget. It's the same widget, but with another layout and style. So we can see this layout, a column-based layout, is better for mobile, and we will use it on mobile. Now, in order to implement our registration, we need a data collection. So what this app needs, it needs to create a collection, define its schema, its data fields, and then in its code, will it be the widget's code or its backend code, needs to read and write data from this collection. And of course, we expect this collection to be installed on the site when the application is installed. So that's exactly how data collections work in Wix Blocks. So let's create our subscriptions collection. But before we create it, I want to update something in my app. I have created another utility function called get subscriptions collection name. We just need to provide it with our application's namespace. And then it will return the full qualified ID of our collection inside of our applications, which is our namespace/subscriptions. So let's go ahead and create our data collection. We'll call it subscriptions. And we'll add 4 fields. The first one is the end date. Then the email ID. Additionally, we need the contact ID that we will be creating. And we need another Boolean field that indicates if this subscription was already notified. And that's it. We have our collection. We just need to change its permissions because any visitor can add content to it. And that's it. We have our collection. So now it's a good time to actually implement the registration. So we want to add the registration widget as an inner widget of our countdown widget. To do that, we simply open the Add the Elements panel and drag and drop our widget. Let's update its layout. So I want it stretched across these cells with 100% width. And let's give it a meaningful ID, registration. I also want to set the margins. That's nice. Now this widget also has a mobile preset. Let's see how it looks like. So it's a good start, but the new elements that we added don't sit so well. So we can fix it really easily. Let's go here to desktop. And we click Use on all presets. Now, all we need to do is update the font here. And for this inner widget, we want in the mobile preset to use its mobile preset. Oh, that's nice. So now let's implement the registration logic. So we'll select the registration widget, and for the onSubmit event, call our non-existent onSubmit function. Now let's create it. So we'll call it onSubmit. It receives one parameter called email. Now we want to create a new contact. So for that, we have yet another utility called create contact. We just need to pass the email and it will create a new contact. Let's do that. This needs to be asynchronous. Create contact. We pass the email. Now let's use the Wix data API to add data to our subscriptions collection. So we'll call insert. Now we need to provide the collection ID. So we said we have our get subscriptions collection name function. It will return the full ID. Let's insert our data. So the contact ID is contact.contact ID. The end date is a new date with the $widget dot props dot end date. And the email ID is $widget dot props dot email ID. And that's it. We implemented the registration. So let's test it. We can build our application again. Let's click build and pick a major version. Now, once this new version is ready, when I go back to the editor, I should see an update notification that notifies me that I have a pending update for my application. And I will click it and update my application. Okay, so version 2 is built. It is ready for me. Let's get back to the editor here and open the private apps panel. And I can see indeed I have a notification here. I'm currently with version 1.0, but I know I have a new version 2.0. So let's update our application. So our app is being updated. And now since we have UI changes for our widget, when the update is complete, we save the editor and it automatically reloads with the new UI and all of the changes. So we can see we got the notify me UUI. And if we go to the databases tab here on the editor, we should be seeing our new data collection, subscriptions. And of course, it will be empty. So let's fill it. Let's register for a notification. And so we need to provide a triggered email ID for this widget. Let's go to this site's dashboard. Let's go to developer tools, triggered emails. And I have already created a triggered email here. Let's just copy its ID and paste it here. Incredible. Let's publish and register on our live site. So I'll click notify me, enter my email, and submit. Thank you for registering. Let's go back to the editor and open our collection once again. And we should see our new subscription. Amazing. It has the correct end date and the email ID. This is the contact ID of my new contact. And of course, it's not notified yet. So it's time to actually implement this email notification. So for that, we need backend code. Let's go back to our Blocks application. And you can see I have already created here the notifier.jsw file. And it has a single function called notify. Let's see what it does. It's really simple. So it queries again the subscriptions collection based on the condition that this record is not notified. Then it loops through all of these subscriptions and again uses our utility function get remaining time to get the remaining time for this subscription. And if the days component equals 0, this means we have less than 1 day away and we want to email this contact. So we use the triggered emails API from Wix CRM backend. We call email contact, provide the email ID of our triggered email and the contact ID we want to send the email to. Then we just update the subscription to be notified true, and we update using Wix data. That's it, really simple. So let's get back to our editor and implement a scheduled job that will execute our functionality once every hour. So in order for that to work, we just need a little bit of glue code. I've created here a backend module that just needs to import the notify function from my application using our namespace. That's the namespace that we picked together. And this just exports one function, invoke notify, that invokes the notify function from our application. Now all that's left to do is to define a scheduled job in our jobs.config. And it's really simple. It invokes the invoke notify function from our backend module. And it does that once every hour. And at the moment, it will be on the 18th minute of every hour. Now it's 10:53 here. Let's change this to 54 and publish. So now when we open our collection again, we should be seeing that the subscription was notified. And indeed, it was notified. And of course, it can take a few minutes for my email system to actually send the triggered email. But that's practically it. So let's sum this up. We saw how Wix Blocks allows us to create full applications that allows for a reusability of our front end and back end. These applications are responsive across all sites, Wix Editor and Editor X. And these apps are full apps with data collections, backend logic, and more. Thank you very much.